Welcome to the Dreams of Consciousness podcast. If you'd be so kind, would you mind introducing yourself?
Hi, this is Morean from Alkaloid, and I'm greatly honored to be on this wonderful podcast.
And Maureen, how would you describe the music that you make with Alkaloid?
Ourselves, we are using the term extreme progressive metal, and maybe that bears some explaining because, well, many of us have a background in death metal, in brutal death metal, and in technical death metal. But when we founded this band, we wanted to step away a little bit from that niche because, sure, we can play and we are famous for it, but we didn't want our music to be about technique. This band is all about songwriting, and it's basically a composers collective where everybody gets to do what they want, and our tastes are broader than just tech death or whatever. So the band to us is a vehicle to explore any musical direction we want, which means that we feel more at home with the prog moniker than with the tech death moniker, because also, prog is a term for everything and nothing. So just to give ourselves the maximum freedom to do whatever we want in the future, we call ourselves a prog band, but at the same time, we never want to lose the heavy side of the band, because you will see that with a lot of prog bands who maybe originally came from heavier music, and as they explore the proggy sides of their music, they tend to lose the heavy component, and we never want to do that. So that's why we refer to Alkaloid as extreme prog metal.
And in this exploring the progressive side or your progressive influences and your influences outside of metal, would you say that you also draw from a lot of classical and jazz and music like that?
By now, yes, actually, and there is never a conscious decision ahead of songwriting. We're going to go in this direction or that direction, because we want, as I explained, we want to keep the freedom to react to whatever the muses, bring us. But through the course of our albums, it became obvious that there is space in our music for unexpected elements. And on the last album, Newman, we had a couple of actual jazz parts thrown in there, which are mainly in the songs that Hannes wrote. He happens to be really good at jazz drums as well, which not many people know, and he just, I think, chucked in like a little jazzy section here and there, and I love it to death. I was so happy when I heard his demos and heard that there's moment of actual jazz happening. And we very much approach our metal basis of our music with this open mindset, so that at any time we can feature, like, for example, in a track like Kernel Panic, the opener of our second album, it starts like a song by Yes, 80s Yes, basically.
Yeah.
So a completely new sound for us. But then the whole point of it is to go, fluently into something that sounds more like Morbid Angel than prog rock. And in that vein, we like to surprise ourselves as well, as much as the listeners. Whether we throw in, something classical and polyphonic like we did in the Bach project, or we throw in, 10 seconds of flamenco, or a little jazzy drum solo, or a gospel choir. All these things, I think, also define us, because we try to go a little bit further than what we ourselves would expect from what we did before. And in that sense, yeah, let's say the non-metal elements in our music will for sure always have an important function in our music, but they do have to relate to heavy music as well, because it would be very tempting to say, okay, we make an all ballads album with no, heavy beats and no harsh vocals, but that would also mean that we neglect an important side of Alkaloid, which is that of a metal band. So yeah, we are ready to use whatever comes along, whatever spiked our interest, but it will always have to relate to metal in a meaningful way.
Can you tell me about your musical background? Did you grow up listening to a lot of jazz and classical and flamenco as well as metal?
Jazz, not at all. I'm from a rather conservative town in Bavaria in the south of Germany. And after, I started guitar lessons at 12 years old. We immediately started a band. We couldn't play yet, but me and some friends, we got together and kind of learned together to write songs and to find our identity and to find our voice. And all that happened in a kind of isolated bubble out in the province, which was problematic in the sense that we couldn't really connect to a bigger scene. So the band went nowhere. We stayed a local band. But the good thing was that we had complete creative freedom. Like nobody ever told us what we could or couldn't write. And that was a very good basis to then later go into professional music. And in my case, I got obsessed with flamenco, Spanish music from the gypsy heritage, which is also fast and dark and rhythmical, and it has a lot of similarities to metal from a kind of fundamental point of view, what kind of music it is. So when I was 21, I moved to the Netherlands to study flamenco guitar at the conservatory, actually. And once I was there, my interest in classical composition just became bigger because I discovered so much incredible music, especially like 20th century Eastern European composers like Stravinsky, Shostakovich, Bartok, Ligeti. All that really resonated with me. So I actually graduated in classical composition, and I've been working for over 25 years as a professional classical composer, writing scores for orchestras, chamber music, the odd films or dance projects, like whatever came my way, but most of it is, let's say, acoustic concert music. And in parallel, I've always kept my bands going. So in a way, I was never pure as neither as a listener nor as a player. And the more interesting elements I'm exposed to, the happier I am. So in a way, also Alkaloid as a metal band that is open to all kinds of things that you wouldn't expect is completely in line with how I always perceived music, because there's so much awesome stuff out there, and sometimes you find the most incredible things that touch you personally in a culture that has nothing to do with your own. For example, in the conservatory in my first year, we had an obligatory lesson in gamelan. So that's Indonesian percussion music, which is very remote from Western music. But there's a style of gamelan on the island of Bali, which is super brutal and super fast. And when we got to play that in school, I thought, man, this is Slayer, but on some kind of
Right.
kitchenware like
Yeah, yeah.
stuff. But it was so much fun to play, and you could approach it with the same fire that you would play a Slayer song with. So in that sense, I always saw so many connections between things that are perceived as disconnected, especially in music and in art, that the most interesting thing to me has always been to find connections between things that people might not see as connected, and kind of proving that they belong together or that they can belong together, because I think that automatically creates also something of interest and prevents that you repeat yourself once you found something that works, which is a trap that a lot of people fall into. And we just wanted to dedicate our work to finding things that haven't been done before, and all the while not becoming a purely experimental band that put out stuff that doesn't make any sense. And that is a curious balance, I have to say. It takes a lot of work, not so much to find interesting stuff or to come up with, let's say, unusual ingredients, but to make sure that all these things work well together in something that is undoubtedly an album full of metal songs that everybody can enjoy.
Yeah. And that's the connections between classical music and metal music is one of the things I'd really like to speak to you about. It comes up a lot on this podcast when I speak to somebody who has a background similar to yours in terms of going to music school and studying composition and studying music outside of metal. When I was about 13 or 14, I heard a Manowar, the band Manowar playing a version of Flight of the Bumblebee. And maybe about 4 or 5 years after that, Emperor released a classical version of one of the songs from their first album. And so it was always on my mind
Mm,
that classical music and metal were never as far apart as people might think. And the
mm.
difference is mainly the instruments used. Do you think there's some merit to that idea?
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree, and I speak from experience as a composer of, a couple of decades now, who has tackled like everything that life threw at him. And my conclusion was exactly that let's say the border between genres very often is more a question of instrumentation than of the music itself. And I realized this many times because I've been fortunate to do a bunch of orchestral encounters with metal bands, whether it was non-Euclid or well, recently Alkaloid with the Bach project, or even the Triptychon Requiem, in which I collaborated as a co-composer and arranger. Um, the thing is, I I have to add some nuance to the discussion because many people say, "Oh, metal and classical music are so similar to each other," and in a certain sense, it's true. And I'll speak about that in a second. But I could also almost write a book about all the ways in which the two are absolutely not the same, because it's a bit of a dangerous statement to put out there because um, to me, a good encounter between classical music and metal is not the metal band standing there doing the exact same thing they always do, and then just for the looks of it, putting a string orchestra there who play like two notes while the band is, shredding themselves to death.
Right.
And that is very much how I saw for example, the Metallica orchestral collaboration. I was super excited about it because I used to be like a huge Metallica fan. And the concert starts, and the band goes as only they can. And I was waiting for the orchestra to join because I know as a classical composer that the level of players in classical music is ridiculously high, and most orchestral musicians could play along with these crazy, thrash metal tempos. But the arranger chose to just put like, a little bit of orchestral ketchup over the songs as they are.
Right. Yeah.
So that means that the orchestra just, while the band plays all these super tight 16th notes and, gallop forwards, the orchestra is just leaning back going, me, me. And as a composer, you can imagine how painful that is because I hear potential and I hear all the things that could have been done with it. And I saw this in a lot of orchestral collaborations. I have to mention a few that I think are incredibly successful. And first and foremost, it would be Dimmu Borgir because they had an incredibly, or still have an incredibly capable arranger who managed to find space for good orchestral parts uh, in the midst of this ultra full triggered, concrete block of extreme metal. So it takes quite a lot of skill, and you need to know exactly what you're doing. And a similar thing you can see in bands like Flesh God Apocalypse or Karach Angren, who have also professional composers in their bands. Also, Septic Flesh is another good example. If they work with orchestra, the orchestral part is really good because they have somebody who understands both genres. And I think that's what it takes. So the fusion is not as easy as it might seem on the surface. And sure, there have been a lot of female fronted kind of gothic metal bands
Right.
who employ the classical sound of the voice. And sure, there is a relation there. But if they do this takes the music, you take away the voice and you take away the songs of female fronted metal. To me, it's more like pop with a little bit of distorted guitars, where you also see, okay, the heaviness of it has been sacrificed a little bit. And to me, what is most interesting is where in classical music can we find the heaviness of metal and take it from there. And in that sense, I have a slightly different angle, if I may elaborate
Oh,
still.
absolutely. This is
Um,
something that I'm very interested in because, if I can just interject, I'll let you go on in a second. But when we talk about like pure or true or whatever, like there's an element to heavy metal when we say that it's heavy, where it needs to be ominous, it needs to be angry, it needs to be, all these emotions that you'll find in some classical music, but definitely not all. Classical music encompasses
yeah,
all kinds of emotions and feelings and purposes. And some of that anger and that ominous feeling gets lost, I think, depending on the instruments you use, or in the example that you pointed out about the Metallica collaborations, trying to add something that maybe detracts from the heaviness. So I'm curious, in your approach, how do you keep that heaviness when you're adding classical instrumentation?
well, that's a very good question, which I'm happy to talk about, but it's not going to be an easy answer. And just to maybe finish my thought from before, real quick, um, you need to ask yourself the question, what is metal? And it seems easy to define, but it's not once you limit yourself. So, for example, if like in our Bach project, we had acoustic instruments on stage. So that meant that if the metal band is at full blast, we're not going to hear much of the classical instruments anymore. But yet we wanted to prove these acoustic instruments are also metal. So we had to look for different parameters that make metal metal. And one of them, as you correctly also mentioned, is the choice of notes. If you choose dark tonalities or different scales than just the boring old major and minor for your riffs, it doesn't matter if you put them in a cello section in a classical orchestra or in a metal band, because the notes themselves have the essence of what I would call metal. And music history is full of examples like that. For example, the one piece almost everybody knows is Mars, the Bringer of War by Gustav Holst, which was written, 115 years ago or something. Um, and the way that this piece starts, like snare drums and low strings and low brass going ba-da-da-dum, bum, ba-ba-bum, ba-da-da-dum, bum, ba-ba-bum, bo,
Right.
will,
Wow.
nice evil notes, nice riff, nice beat. This was 19 or something like that. That to me is pure metal. And it's not for nothing that exactly that piece was the inspiration of not just one, but three seminal metal tracks, them being Black Sabbath by Black Sabbath.
Right.
And Geezer Butler said that the inspiration for the tritone riff was Gustav Holst's Mars, the Bringer of War. And the same was true for Am I Evil by Diamond Head
Right. Right. Yeah.
in the early 80s. And then just a few years later for the track Hell Awaits by Slayer. And
Yeah.
I mean, there you have three bands that really changed metal history. And each of them, at least in those songs, mention, well, this early 20th century classical music work as the main inspiration. And like this, there are other composers. And this is exactly, of course, as a metalhead, when I went, started going into classical music, those were exactly the composers that interested me, because Bartok, for example, has a couple of string quartets that a couple of movements can only be called metal. The same for Shostakovich, the second movement of his eighth string quartet. We all know it, and most metalheads that are a bit literate in music, arrive at the point that they feel forced to steal that because it's so awesome. The Rite of Spring by Igor Stravinsky is another grand example, and you can even go further. If you go into post-war avant-garde, if you have composers like Krzysztof Penderecki, for example, Polish composer who used ugly, sort of horror-like blocks of sound, of clusters that are more evil than any metal band is managing to sound. Specifically, a piece called Polymorphia. I
Yeah.
recommend everybody to take a listen. You know, put your headphones on, crank them in 11,
People
and
people
close your eyes and
people
see what happens.
people may be familiar with Penderecki because the director Kubrick used a lot of his music in his movies like The Shining.
Exactly. So, you know, which metal band could supply a more evil sounding soundtrack than what Penderecki did? I mean, maybe a band like Portal from Australia could, because I adore them just because every single noise that comes out of them is evil and I love it. But you know what I mean?
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah.
so that goes back to your comment that the term classical music doesn't mean all that much in terms of what it expresses because most people know some Mozart and some Beethoven, and maybe sure there are some bombastic parts from symphonies, but for the rest, people have this image of nice organized chamber music in major and minor, and nothing too excessive, which is true for a lot of popular classical music because not everybody wants evil sounds when they listen to music, but the classical music I write and the classical music that made me go into classical music is of a whole different order. And sure, it falls into the same genre because it's all played on string instruments and wind instruments and whatnot, but musically it's much, much closer to Slayer than to, some Mozart clarinet concerto. And of course, this is a matter of taste and of how you experience a piece of music. And maybe somebody, gets his metal kicks out of Beethoven and out of Rhapsody, and I get them out of Slayer, Mayhem, and Penderecki. So you see, it's a complex subject which I love to speak about, but it can't be brought down to one sentence that is true or not, which is yeah, metal and classical music are the same thing. Yeah, like yes and no.
Right, right. I understand. Um, I'd like to speak to you about the way that you integrated or even transformed classical music into metal on this live album that you're about to put out. But before we get there, I'd like to ask you about your songwriting. Since you studied guitar at a conservatory, do you always start your songwriting with guitar, or do you use other instruments as well?
It greatly depends, and I'm speaking as just as a composer, not specifically as a composer of metal songs. Of course, if I write for guitars and I'm a guitarist, I will write it on a guitar. But nowadays, well, you have your digital audio workstation, your Pro Tools or whatever. You have it open, and I always prefer to leave the choice to my ears, even though I use my brain and my technique and my knowledge of music theory and whatever to come up with material and to organize it or whatever. But at the end of the day, it's always the ears that need to judge if something's good enough or not. So I like to record everything. And if I write for instruments that I don't play, so yeah, drums or violins or trombones. Nowadays, you have orchestral libraries which are not perfect, but which go a long way in giving you a demo what it's going to sound like. So no matter who I write for, I always write kind of with my ears, and I do use guitars also to write just melodies for other instruments, just simply because I'm sitting there and it's standing next to me, and it's the only instrument I know how to play. But the tools you use when writing are not necessarily defining how well it's going to work. It's just that, of course, if I write for guitars, I'll play it myself and I'll find the riffs on guitar. But sometimes it's good to also break through that because the danger is that you end up writing what's in your fingers and then you spin in very tiny circles doing always the same thing. So sometimes it's good to force yourself to take notes from somewhere else or maybe make chords on a piano and then find them on a guitar because you will come up with slightly different chords than you would just on the instrument itself. But yeah, at the end of the day, it's a MIDI score in Pro Tools and a guitar that helps me a little bit. The more important thing is actually how well you know in your head what you want to write before you actually start looking for notes. That is where it's actually happening because many of us know this, the fear of the white paper, so to speak. If you have all the options, it can be paralyzing to have to make a choice between everything. So I find it greatly helps if you have a good vision of what it is that you want to write that can guide you through all these choices of notes, of sounds, of form, of whatnot, because then you always have a direction that is given. You give self a direction and then you follow it through this maze of all these possibilities, because yeah, as a professional composer you can't really afford to waste a lot of time finding out what it is that you want to make, because you have to deliver and every day you have to write a certain amount of music. So the plan before you actually take your guitar or your clarinet or whatever it is that you use is much more important than the question, what do you use to choose the notes.
Specific to your work with Alkaloid, I mean, obviously this latest release is a little bit different, but uh, is the songwriting and the arrangements for Alkaloid fairly collaborative, or do you start everything on your own?
Um, well, theoretically, it's collaborative, but in practice, what we see most is that you know a band member will just write whatever they want to write, and then they throw it in the group. And usually, we don't have a lack of material. The opposite problem that there's too much stuff. So then it's about what do we choose to put together on an album? What do we need? What is missing from the pool of songs that is there? And occasionally, for example, Hannes will get a song from another band member where he, as producer and engineer of the album, has a better view of how it fits into the total picture of the album as a whole, or from his experience can just say like, I think this song is a bit too short or a bit too long, and then sometimes he will insert something that wasn't there in the first version, or we also collaborated in a way that Linus, sends us a bunch of songs, and then I pick one and I say, okay, I wanna try something with this song, and I add my own stuff. But this also usually happens remotely, so that means we send stuff to each other, and then it's either exactly what we're going to put on the album, which is usually the case. I mean, I'll add my vocals also to other people's songs, and I'll compose them. I'll write the lyrics and whatnot. But basically, people have a vision of how it should be, and then sometimes we give it another round to go over it again. But we don't write really together as much as we would like to. And with every album, we say like, okay, this time we really sit together and develop stuff together. But last time that didn't happen because of the pandemic, because we couldn't get together, for example, which was annoying. But well, then here we were again, just sending demos to each other and then finding out what it is that we wrote once everything was done and mixed, which is also nice. It's a nice surprise. But me as a guitar player, I would very much prefer Hannes to make his own drum lines, because as a guitarist, I can never make drum lines as good as what a drummer would make. But that would require some time and actually develop it. So yeah, let's see if now that we're starting to write the next album, we can actually find a chance to do some things together. It would be awesome.
The demos that you submit to Hannes, how complete are they? Do they have temp drums and vocal patterns and things like that?
Yeah, yeah. What I write, I usually know very much in detail what I want. And for my own feeling, I also have to kind of finish the song in order to know that it's that it's finished. It feels a bit weird if I have a very specific idea to just put half of it out there and then hope that the others are going to pick up on it. So yeah, my demos are with a drum computer, but for the rest, I play everything, and I make the sounds, I make the words, and at the end, how they're recorded is pretty much exactly how I wanted it on the demos. Um, it's basically the same for the other writers. Usually, they'll use Guitar Pro, which is a little program where you can easily make MIDI demos also of the guitars and everything. which is what a lot of people use. But I prefer to record my bits with the actual instruments, also because the demo gets better. It sounds more organic, and I have a much better view of how it's actually going to work as a song. Because this is the danger if you just program everything into MIDI. Even if you do it in a competent way, when the time comes to play the stuff for the first time, sometimes you see that it's super difficult or impossible, where it just sounded reasonable in the MIDI version. So, yeah, there have been a couple of moments that we realized, oh, maybe we went just a little bit too far here and there, and then you have to kill yourself to get it recorded. But on the other hand, that's also interesting because you force yourself to grow. It's always important to follow your musical vision, because the question, can you play it, is a bit secondary. Like for the composer, it's important that the right music gets born and is out there, and then we can look around if we can actually play it or not. But of course, ideally, what you write and what you believe in should be something that you can also show to people on a stage. And yeah, so there's a little bit of back and forth there. Um, but again, what counts is the idea, not so much the medium with which you manifest it. As long as it, ends up on an album and hopefully ends up in a concert, it doesn't really matter how it came about.
Is the ability um, to perform this live and to bring this to an audience in person very important? Something that's on your mind a lot when you're in the writing phase? Or do you feel like some stuff can just
Uh,
exist in the studio?
well, some things are definitely not possible that easily to play live, and we allow ourselves moments like this when we are writing, because the thing is, so we have, three studio albums, one live album now coming out with new material on it. And we are looking at a lot of songs that we're going to have to choose from the next album. And I want to write a bunch more as well, because I mean, the fun is exactly the writing. Um, so we know that we're never going to play every single track from an album. When you put out your first album, you might be, and then you go play live, you might be forced to play all the tracks on your first album. But
Right.
we are not anymore. We have the opposite problem, which is how the hell can we fit a good representation of everything we have done into a set list of 40 minutes, 60 minutes. So, any choice we make for songs that we play are always going to exclude songs that we would like to play as well. And plus, there's a serious aspect of preparation to learn these songs, because we push ourselves to the limit, which also means that the solos are crazy, and then sometimes the riffs are require you to practice for months until you can play the song from A to Z. Um, so yeah, in that sense, we don't worry too much, because we know that there's always going to be some songs that are going to be possible to be played live. So, for example, in my whole Dyson Sphere saga, which is like a multi-part ongoing series of songs that is, I add chapters to it with every album that came out. On the last album, there were three new songs, and the last one was so conceptual, where the backwards version of the song becomes its own accompaniment and stuff like that. So certain conceptual things I have to solve in a technical way, and I knew this is not going to work live. And I wanted a super low sound, so I used 8-string guitars. And you're not going to bring 8-string guitars just for one song. It's just too much
Right, yeah.
practical misery to put upon yourself. So I knew from the beginning we're probably not going to play that song live, but we can play the other songs live, and we just did. So you have an idea while you are writing the songs that some things might not work live, but it'll never be that we are not aware of it, or that we write a full album that cannot be played live, because that would be a bit stupid. On the contrary, we even took some songs from the Bach project, in which we had 11 musicians on stage, and started playing them just as a metal band in our regular metal shows. And that also works because at the end of the day, music, like all music, is just notes, and the question is rather simple. Okay, I want these notes to sound. How do I get them to sound from the things that we have here? And it's a very kind of crude and simple approach, but it really works for me because you make yourself independent of the means you have to say something. And of course, sometimes it's not possible. You can't have, a 15-part composition if you have three musicians to play it. You're going to have to sacrifice something. So in that sense, it's a diverse situation, and we have enough material to react to whatever is possible to do live. And if we can't play this song, we can play the other song, and hopefully all the songs are good. So it's not something that bothers us, but it is a factor, of course, when you write, to make sure that at least there's a couple of songs that you can for sure play live.